Okay, good evening. My name is Kate Meenan-Waugh, and I'm on the board of Solas Nua, and I want to welcome you to our April Irish Popcorn series. Tonight, very special, we have Hidden War, Hidden War, the story of the IRB, a 2019 production of Deaglán Media. And with us tonight for the post-film discussion is Deaglán Ó Mocháin, joining us from Derry, and Patrick Mahoney, a historian involved in the research for the film, and he joins us from County Louth. We'll have a longer introduction of both our panelists and a chance to hear about what they're working on in the post-film discussion. As always, we will use the chat function for general comments that you would like to make, and we will use the Q&A for questions you would like our panelists to consider. And please do stick around after the Q&A to hear a roundup of the many exciting things coming up at Solas Nua, and for the opportunity to complete a survey, which will enter you into a prize draw for a Solas Nua Summer Theater Pass. And as always, we want to thank our partners, NYU DC, Tom McIntyre and Polly Terzian, and their crew for making this screening possible. So please sit back, grab your popcorn and a drink of choice, and enjoy Hidden War, the story of the IRB. The runtime for the film is about 50 minutes. And we'll see you after the film. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. The first thing I want to do is apologize to our viewers as well as our guests tonight for the snafu having to do with the live transcript function. It is a computer-generated capability that allows people who need closed captioning for the entire film to see the spoken language. Obviously, the computer that does it does not understand Irish. So some of those initial translations were quite hysterical, but we're glad everyone figured out how to turn it on and off as they needed it. So
was it Connemara Irish kid?
I don't know. But anyway, so here we are, and let me take the opportunity to tell you a little bit more about our panelists. We have Deaglán Ó Mocháin. He has a PhD from Queen's University in Belfast, and he founded Deaglán Media in 2010, and has produced and or directed around 20 Irish language documentaries since then, including our October 2020 Irish popcorn film, Bram Stoker August Dracula. Deaglán films typically focus on history, culture, and politics, as well as Gaeltacht life in Ireland. He is also involved in Irish language activities in Derry City. So welcome again, Deaglán.
Thank you.
Patrick Faoi Cheilt is a Casperson Fellow in History and Culture at Drew University and a former Fulbright Scholar at the National University of Ireland, Galway. His writings have been published widely in both Irish and English, and most recently, his bilingual volume, Recovering an Irish Voice from the American Frontier, the Prose Writings of Owen O'Cahill, was released with the University of North Texas Press in May 2021, so it's just come out. His wife, Siafra, was one of the historians interviewed on screen during the film, so this is a family of historians. He's finishing up his own PhD, where he's digging deep into the history of American Fenians. Let's return to language for a minute, because one of the questions we got was, why was this film made in Irish? And maybe, Deaglán, you can tell us a little bit about the environment and space for making films in Irish, the support of the Irish Language Film Broadcast Fund, etc.
Sure. The Irish Language Broadcast Fund, which supported this film, was set up as part of some of the political arrangements in the North. I guess there was there's ongoing issues around Irish language schooling, for example, and there's an issue presently around whether there should be an Irish Language Act in the North. There's one in the South where it remains the official language. So I've been an Irish speaker I acquired it later on in life. I grew up in the South, but I didn't really have much of an appreciation of Irish language until I went to university a bit later on and started encountering people primarily from Belfast, I have to say, who were like me, from a working class background and who had Irish, and who had probably quite a developed political understanding of the significance of that. So after my PhD, I had an opportunity to do a one-year course in Gweedore, an Irish-speaking part in West Donegal. And since then, I've been making Irish language films. And that's really all I do. That's my full-time work. And I've no real interest in making non-Irish language documentaries at this stage. It just represents a choice in life, to live my life through Irish. Bring up my family through Irish. I'm involved in Irish language issues in Derry as well. We've 3 Gael School Irish language schools in the city, and it's quite a growing phenomenon. I guess there's a colonial context for it as well, an anti-colonial context, and that's partly reflected in some of the themes that come through the documentary as well.
Right. Yeah, well, film is such a powerful medium to use that language. And Padraig, can you tell us a little bit about how you came to the Irish language? I think it's an interesting story.
Yeah, and I suppose it kind of actually reflects a bit of Deaglán's own kind of story there, in that I suppose it would have actually been kind of a Belfast contingent as well. My goddad's actually from the New Lodge Road in Belfast, in North Belfast, and he'd be an Irish speaker. And I suppose I kind of came to it a bit later in life as well. My granny was actually a native Irish speaker from West Cork. And so we would have had Irish in the house kind of as kids. But like Deaglán said about even growing up in the South, is that it was kind of in our house, but it was in the background. And even reflecting your own experience, Kate, we were kind of thinking, oh, geez, we don't want to be, talking that, and let her kind of, go on with it. But I actually started working for my goddad on a construction site, in a building site in New York. And he lives in the United States now. And we would just talk in Irish all day with each other. And, I'd actually show up about 45 minutes early each morning, and, he'd give me an Irish lesson. And then during the day, we'd use the terms or the phrases he'd given me, and I'd record them on my phone initially. And then we'd kind of just go like that. And, we were speaking more and more Irish then as time went on. And there's something about hearing the language as well, naturally, with, we had guys on the site speaking Portuguese and Spanish and Jamaican patois and, Polish, and all the language is kind of floating around in the air. So it was very natural to kind of speak our own language and speak Irish. Mm-hmm. And I suppose with the documentary, I think it's brilliant that Deaglán has kind of told the story of the Fenians in Irish, because there's kind of a historical trend amongst some in years past to kind of say that the Fenians didn't care about the Irish language, or that they didn't put any emphasis on the Irish language. But kind of I actually have an article coming out this month, but it shows that a lot of them were predominantly native speakers from the west of Ireland, and they actually did see that as part of the new republic that they wanted to achieve, was the restoration of the Irish language.
And Deaglán, yourself as a historian, what was important to you that people knew or understand about the IRB after seeing this film? Like what pushed you to make this film and bring all this wonderful research in, these wonderful commentators? And I also want to talk a little bit about the live action stuff, but let's find out about the origins of the film and the story that you wanted to make sure people knew about the IRB.
The documentary grew out of a series of a couple of films that we made from 2014 onwards. It wasn't particularly planned like this, because each year we approach the broadcasters with a slate of ideas, and a lot of the times you don't get to make the films that you really want to make, but we were lucky with a selection of films. So we did a documentary on Irish suffrage, Irish suffragettes in 2014, as our take on the 1916 revolution from a feminist perspective, if you like. And there was a socialist and a feminist and a nationalist perspective. And out of that, we like to try and take an approach to something like 1916 and maybe invert it a little bit or come at it from another perspective. So a second documentary was on Frank Sheehy Skeffington, who was murdered during the 1916 rising, who was a prominent pacifist and was married to a very prominent suffragette as well. And that gave us another take on, how non-combatants, maybe who were progressive, viewed 1916. And then we finally got to do a more direct take on 1916, but also wanted to invert in another way. I mean, as was alluded in there, one of the historians was saying, typically 1916 is considered as maybe the main characters are Patrick Pearse and James Connolly for people with a passing knowledge of 1916. And when you look at it from the perspective of the IRB and this more conspiratorial take on it, it places two other characters in the foreground, Sean McDermott and Thomas Clark. So I guess we're always trying to question and push and probe and move away from cliche and maybe which we all suffer, or I suffer from as well. I mean, you like to get into the meat of an issue and try and work out what was the dynamic happening here. And the IRB is a little bit maybe under-researched still. There's some great work out there, but it's still, I think it was a story that needs to be told, and maybe to try to link those threads with John Devine and going back to the areas that Padraig specializes in, particular the role of the diaspora and the role in America, and Tom Clark's role as a young radical, spending a long time in jail and then coming back and having really facing a very ruthless enemy and developing quite a ruthless methodology to pursue revolutionary aims. I guess there's a lot of different things in there. It's quite a complex story to tell. So the methodology has to be to try and tell it through maybe characters and incidents and keep it quite simple. I mean, that drives historians mad. They've just written a 1,000-page book, and Tom Clark and we're trying to tell a story through a couple of vignettes. But, that's the challenge and the fun in documentary, I think, is trying to visualize the great work of historians and try to do it in a simplistic enough way that people will follow it, but also try to tell the story at a sophisticated level as well, with certain layers to it. Hopefully you get the big picture, and then within that there's enough detail to satisfy historians as well.
Yeah, and I think the live action sequences are quite helpful. And I think sometimes you see these types of things, the combination of the talking heads and the live action, and it doesn't always fit together. It doesn't always work as well as what I think it does in this film. So can you tell us a little bit about putting the live action piece together and what was involved in that?
It's absolutely torturous trying to do that. There's only a few places in Derry where you can do it, and this isn't a complaint. We don't have budgets really to do it properly, so you have to be very imaginative. And what's interesting as well with this documentary is we did two at the same time. So Michael Davitt, who features in the IRB documentary, is a really interesting Irish historical figure, and we did a biography of Michael Davitt at the same time. And we used the same actors and we used the same setups and scenarios. We had to be really careful that we didn't cross over or cross-contaminate. So we shot all of that in 5 days, just very heavily scripted. Primarily, we did the interviews first. Always like to let the historian shape the narrative. The process is that you would have a reasonable idea of your elements and the historians that you'd like to use, and they're all first rate. And the understanding and the work of people like Patrick's invaluable in keeping us right. And then we try to stand back from that. Once that's done, there's very little editorializing from the company. There is, of course, in the editorial process where you're deciding the order. So we weren't initially thinking of a chronology, but it made sense to do it like that. And then we developed a few methods, like those posters help maybe to tie, link certain characters and themes together. You may have recognized that from the Dracula film as well. We used something similar as a way of linking visually and thematically, and to give a bit of time to let things sink in. But the drama is always very, very difficult to film properly. You have to bring in we have a great crew, and they're all some of the dodgiest people in Derry featuring as actors and extras. They're great. Try to make it fun for people as well. It's long and difficult and tough, but it's all to do with preparation and planning, really having a vision that's already been shaped by the historians, and you're trying to bring that to life. You're trying to bring their expertise to life in a way that makes sense to people. Exactly as you're saying, you don't want to watch that and say, why is that person wearing a watch? Or, I mean, I can see all the fault lines in the film every time I watch that. I'm laughing. I know where we've had to cut corners and try to make it look real. It's like, the back of somebody's house or whatever it is. It can be very basic at times.
But the other joy is every time you see it, you learn something new. At least I do. So we are getting some really interesting questions in. So Patrick, we're going to ask you to help us out here with a couple of them. David Lara, to what extent was he an important member of the IRB? And, you know, of course, we know he kind of went back and forth with states. And tell us a little bit about his association with the IRB.
Yeah, that's an interesting one, actually. I suppose I think Fergal actually might have touched briefly upon it in the film. There it was just that, to my knowledge, and Deaglán, correct me if I'm wrong here, but I think David Lair was only briefly a member of the IRB prior to 1916. So he wouldn't have kind of come from that kind of old tradition of the Fenians, like say a Michael Collins would. And I think it was shown quite well within the film that I think that is probably part of the problem that arises later on with the kind of split, was that Michael Collins.
I had heard that he joined because his junior officers knew more about the Rising than he did. This is in the lead up to the Rising, months before it, and he felt he had to become a member just to be in the loop. And prior to that, his junior officers knew what was happening and he didn't.
That's interesting. That's interesting. And, you know, before 1900, what classes of people would typically join the IRB? You know, did they come from a specific geographic area, or you know, a work cohort, or were they rural, or typically who were the IRB members pre-1900?
So they were primarily working class individuals, both in the United States and in Ireland. I think you have a more of a rural kind of demographic in Ireland probably joining, but also kind of, you know, I think there's a famous quote about them being the kind of town boys. So I think people from kind of the towns as well, working in even the cities. But in America, you're seeing, I mean, the stretch of kind of Fenianism across the breadth and width of the United States is just staggering to look back at now. And you see people in rural districts, even members of the US military at these kind of remote outposts in New Mexico. They have branches of the Fenians there, and a lot of them are kind of economic soldiers as well. So I think that, you know, whether it's in Ireland, England, Scotland, the United States, you know, it's predominantly a working class organization.
Yeah, I concur. I think that's exactly it. One of the interesting things that I learned from making the David film, I hadn't fully appreciated that the to some extent settling the land question provided a lot of the later generation of people who joined the IRB and took part in the revolution. That prior to that, people's lives were so hand to mouth that, you know, culture and politics and revolution weren't necessarily the first things on the mind. They were just barely getting by. And it was that first generation that was able to be maybe schooled and educated towards the end of the 19th century that provided they were the bedrock of the revolutionary period, and also ended up some of the more conservative elements of the later revolution that created some of the tension between urban and rural. People who had a stake in society and land for the very first time, you know, coming from their own class background, you know, becoming teachers and becoming clerks, and, you know, relatively prosperous compared to what the parents' generation would have faced, and the horrors that they might have faced.
And then if we push up to 1916, to what extent do you think the Catawba prison break helped the energy that led to 1916? That's one of our questions in the board here. Either one of you want to grab that?
Yeah, we're going back a bit, I think, with Catawba. It's more of an American story around Dubai. Patrick, you probably have the ins and outs in that one.
I suppose there's somewhat of a kind of a tangential link there, because it was 1876 the Catawba, I think, and like I suppose the one thing I would say there is probably just that I think John Boyle O'Reilly was rescued on the Catawba and arrives in Boston and becomes a really central figure within the movement, kind of just, I suppose, as an editorial kind of, he's running newspapers and things, but he kind of pushes the cause on in that way. But I don't think he had much involvement in kind of militaristic politics when he arrives in the United States. But I think the Catawba, you could use it as one incident of many, and a couple of them are covered within the film, whether it's, you know, in 1871, John Devoy and O'Donovan Rossa landing in New York. and they were called the Cuba Five of the, you know, there's 5 prisoners that landed on the ship to Cuba in New York, and they're treated like celebrities, and it really revitalizes a Fenian movement that was, you know, kind of petering out by the 1860s. They kind of played their hand and it didn't go well. And I think in the same kind of way that Catalpa gives hope to Irish America that the cause isn't dead and that they can take on this empire, and that, you know, the IRB can take on this empire even at home. So I think that's what I would say is probably the influence on 1916. Is it's one instance of many where kind of the diaspora got this kind of successful challenging of the British Empire.
And
So
Devoy's hand would have been very much strengthened by the success of the Catalpa. You know, it gave him a lot of credibility in a very fractious movement. I don't know how they survived. They went through several feuds and power struggles.
Well, it sounds like it was really a shot in the arm for, as what you said, the hope of Irish Americans, you know, to influence or be part of this. We have a couple of other questions, but I want to go back again to some of the process. So the process of the film. Female historians, I love them. And was that a purposeful thing to make sure they were included in this film, or did it just so happen that Padraig's wife and the other historian were the best choices?
It's a policy. I mean, there should have been more female historians, to be honest. We had done a few documentaries that's almost entirely female. There's a growing cohort of younger female historians. I always want to represent age and gender properly when we can, in the crew and in the on screen. It's been an issue in the past. A lot of the 1916 material has been very gender skewed. It's just something to be conscious of, I think. One of the great things that come out of the re-evaluation of the 1916 period was that the role of women was finally given its proper place, and a lot of new research was done, but a lot of older research came to the fore, which is always great to see. I mean, I'm conscious watching that's quite a male-oriented story. It's quite masculine. You know, the IRB is quite a masculine organization, and revolution can often seem like that. There were a few female members, supposedly a few female members of the IRB. Tom Clark's wife was meant to have been a member, and another activist was as well. And women played a key role throughout all of that. Some of that was shot, and some of it, you know, we were constantly, you're struggling to work out what you can get away with in 50 minutes. And yes, in my head, having done the suffragette story,
that's tough.
And we come back to Frank Sheehy's definitely in that, you know, but I mean, you're right there. It's critically important for Irish history to be fully representative.
Well, that's one of the beauties of the film. Now, could you repeat the title of the 1,000-page book? I think you said it's about Tom Clark. Is it? Is it the 1,000-page book you referred to? That's one of our questions. Is it a book about Tom Clark?
Oh no, I was just being a little bit facetious. I was just saying that Padraig had to produce these ginormous books, and we want to make sure we do justice. Like Terry Galway has written the Devoy biography, which is really good. All of those historians have all contributed massively to research in this area in different ways, sometimes through books and other times through films. Briona Niyarma did quite well in the States, the other female contributor, mainly through film. She made a really fantastic 1916 documentary for RTE that looked at the international impact of 1916. So no, it was just a throwaway comment about trying to make sure that
I think somebody panicked thinking, oh no, it's a book I don't know. So we have a couple other questions, and this goes again deep into some of the history of the IRB, but also leading up to the influences of the IRB. What was the impact of the IRB supported 1898 Centenary celebrations? Did it reinvigorate the IRB? Did it make any difference?
Yeah, for sure. But Patrick, do you want to have a go at that one? Tom Clark was the secretary of the Wolftown Committee. There's a really nice story, and didn't finish up in the documentary, but the very last known action of the IRB related to the 1798 commemorations The IRB was very heavily involved in it, and like a lot of their endeavours, there were other people involved in that activity as well. So that there's a wolf tone statue in Stephen's Green in Dublin that's quite well known. It's quite an abstract statue, and that was unveiled by De Valera in when was that, late 60s. And Kathleen Clark was still alive, and one of her last actions before she died was this is Tom Clark's wife, widow, she donated what was left of the money raised by Tom Clark and the 1798 Commemorative Committee. That's considered the last known act of the IRB, that money was handed over to contribute to the wolf tone statue that was unveiled by De Valera in the presence of Kathleen Clark, or very, very soon after her death. I mean, it demonstrates the longevity of it, and I don't think there was any real IRB related activity after 24. There's a couple of characters who consider themselves to be the sort of the last remnants, and maybe they're related to some people in the IRB. They do some sort of quasi mystical ceremony outside Dáil Éireann every January. Researching it, I don't think it has any historical merit.
So Patrick, the late 19th century, that's kind of more in your realm. But how was the Centenary observed in the US? Were the IRB the drivers for the celebrations here, or the programs around it, or?
Yeah, what's fascinating, I suppose, because around the turn of the 20th century, it's interesting to see that the IRB does become, and that was in the documentary, a bit more public in Ireland than they were, say, 40 years previous. But in the US, it's kind of a different story, in so much as you're outside the jurisdiction of the British Empire. So you have that freedom to go and process down the streets throughout from the mid-19th century on. So you would have had even a group of the Irish volunteers in the United States in the 1880s, well before any such movement was founded by that name in Ireland. In New York, they would have been parading around Madison Square Garden in the 1880s and 1890s. And there's always these kind of militant kind of aspects. The difference in the US, of course, as well, is that you have the Spanish-American War kind of breaking out at that time, which is preoccupying part of Irish America. And, it's kind of instilling a different type of militarism within the population to a degree. But yeah, I would say the kind of Fenian element would have been running those kind of commemorations in the US for sure, even though the Fenians by then are very much kind of a thing of the past. In terms of being a formidable organization, it's more kind of Fenian veterans of the 1860s and 70s. They're not really an organization, to any degree at that stage. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And even Clan na Gael, I suppose, would be the kind of that version, the successor of the early Fenians at that stage.
And maybe we could take this opportunity to segue, Patrick, to the subject of your book that's just come out. Really kind of a fascinating story, but if you could just tell us a little bit about the character and what the book does. And I'm sure you'll get some people that'll be interested in reading it and purchasing it. But, tell us about this Owen.
Yeah, well, hopefully there's some interest there, but coincidentally, he's actually from the place Rashawn of this parish. His dad is from Temple Gletton in Limerick. Uh-huh. And he's just a fascinating figure because he finds himself, like many of the Fenians, he's out on the kind of plains of the American West in the 1860s, just as the Civil War is kind of ending. And he's written these stories about his alleged involvement in the Plains Indian Wars. So these kind of some massacres of different Native American tribes or vice versa on settlers. And he's just, all I can call him is really a fascinating figure because he conveys so many of the kind of, he was very much of a man of his age, but he conveys so many of the hypocrisies of a lot of Irish immigrants. One could say of, somebody who very much had a deep memory of the famine, but then speaks of clearing the land in the American West without any regret. But also, he speaks on American imperialism. He has a letter in the book, which is translated, he's writing all in Irish, and then I've translated to English. but he speaks about the Spanish-American War and the kind of expansion of the US into the Philippines. And then also just kind of, he is very much like members of the IRB. He's a working class kind of figure and a working class writer. So he gives kind of an insight into, what life would have been like for kind of common Irish immigrants in the woods of Michigan or Minnesota or out on the plains in the West. So his story is very much kind of in the style of the American tall tale. He goes from kind of talking about how they would raise cabins and, kind of very, very practical details of life of people working in the woods, to then talking about shooting 200 wolves in this kind of scene that invokes Oisin and the Fianna and, lightning striking down, as his shots are like lightning striking and killing the wolves and everything. So he mixes kind of the two styles of kind of Irish myth and this American tall tale to kind of tell his own story of his American experience.
It sounds fabulous, and we placed the link to the book and to Patrick's. You can find out more about Patrick on his website too. And we want to make sure we hear from Deaglán about your next project. Has to do with honey and bees, but it's a bit bigger than that, right?
From IRB to, we've called it Plan B, PLEA, the Irish version, Plan B. It's a documentary about pollinators, and there's a really interesting pollinator plan being implemented in Ireland by some scientists, and they're invoking citizen science to try and get communities and individuals to do what they can to improve the lot of the bee population. So we spent the year chasing bees. In many ways, they're a lot easier to deal with than people. It was great, really enjoyed it. It's coming out, World Bee Day is on I think that's BEE and not BIDET. World Bee Day is on 20th of May, and TTCR are going to show it then.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's an interesting plan because it's very much bottom up and trying to mobilize people to understand a little bit more about what pollinators need to survive and provide habitats for them. And I've noticed a big difference. Just I was driving down the country yesterday. This time of year, there's dandelions everywhere, and there are bees everywhere. It seems like people are content to leave roadside verges, and parts of the gardens are going wild. It's just a beautiful sight. These lovely strong yellows all throughout the country. So it's making a real difference. Maybe 5% of all of the country is currently pollinator friendly because of the work of 2 female scientists from Ireland. It's a great story, and it's full of bees. The documentary has lots of strange looking bees flying about. It's always good.
Well, it's become quite popular to bring this forward too in the US. People are keeping bees because we're at a crisis point with pollinators. So this will be something that we'll all look forward to seeing. I want to thank you both so much. There are more questions, but I'm going to say that we're just really conscious of the fact that Patrick and Deaglán are 5 hours ahead of us. So it means it's about 1:30 in the morning for them. So I want to thank you both again for being part of this film, Deaglán for making this film. And like I said, every time I see it, I learn something more. I do believe that Sean has put into the chat ways that people could see the film again, if you would like to do that, because it is a film that each time you see it, you get a little more out of it. Okay, so we're going to bid you adieu. We're going to ask our audience to stick around because we want to tell you about some of the things coming up at Solas Nua. And but to both Patrick and Deaglán, thank you very, very much. You can sign off, have yourself a nice drink, and get yourselves to bed.
Good kids. Thanks, kids.
Yeah, good. Slán Deaglán.
Thank you, guys. Thank you so much. Okay, so that was our April Irish Popcorn, and thank you all for staying with us and staying through the question and answer period. We have a lot coming up. At Solas Nua. Actually, our next event is tomorrow. where we are commemorating Irish Poetry Day, which is actually the day after, but we're commemorating it tomorrow at 6 p.m. With Sinead Morrissey. And Ambassador Dan Mulhall will do an introduction, and our own Patty Meskel will be facilitating a discussion with Sinead about poetry and the significance of that day. We also have coming up our usual book groups, May 10, May 17, May 24th. So please go onto the website to take a look at those. And the really exciting news is we are back to live theater production. And from May 20th to June 13th, In the Middle of the Fields, a play that Solas Nua has commissioned from Deirdre Kennaghan, who was one of our co-playwrights for the Frederick Douglass Project. This play is being staged live on National Park Service property at P Street and 23rd Street Northwest. It's also known as the P Street Beach. And we're very happy to tell you that we can welcome you to this production with your purchase of a summer theater membership. The membership also allows access to our newest digital play production coming up in June, and a digital version of Fish Amble's Helen Hayes award-winning production of Silent with everyone's favorite Pat Kinnavan. To learn more about the available dates for In the Middle of the Fields and the summer theater membership, please go to our website. And oh my, you do not want to miss the next Irish Popcorn series, which will be May 26th. And we will screen the 2015 documentary Queen of Ireland. And we will be joined by the subject of the film, Rory O'Neill, also known as Panty Bliss, and director Conor Horgan. And they will be in conversation with Anna McCarthy, who is the professor and chair of cinema studies at NYU. So for people interested in the movement of legalizing same-sex marriage and other LGBT issues in Ireland, this will be something you do not want to miss. So that is May 26th. So we want to thank you all for joining us, and we want to thank you for supporting Solas Nua. Don't be shy, go to the website. You can always click the donate button, and we look forward to seeing you at our future events. And we do hope to see you live in person, safely, of course, at In the Middle of the Fields in the coming weeks. So thank you very much.